was just unbelievably devastating. You know, I've had a lot of time to grieve it and a lot of time to work through the anger. But at the time, I mean, I remember sitting in my car in my driveway and just heaving. There was no humanity in that. And I remember reading an article from the Victorian Premier who was like, I don't care.
All right. Hi, everyone. This is Karla. I'm here with Ben, an expat living in the US at the moment who was denied passage to Australia to come back over for his grandfather's funeral. So, Ben, we're keen to hear your story and see what's going on. So tell us what happened.
Well, to set the record straight, I technically wasn't denied. I was denied an exemption to go and visit my grandfather. So, yes, I could come, but that would require me to stay in a hotel/prison for 2 weeks, and then pay for the privilege of that honor to stay in that hotel/prison for 2 weeks. So so my grandfather quickly was declining. He fell and hit his head and went to the hospital. And my mother called and said, "Hey, he's in the hospital. We're not sure how it's going." So I immediately went to the Australian government, to the Victorian DHHS website, because I knew there was the 2-week quarantine that was still enforced by the Victorian government. And went to the website and applied for an exemption. And then that was the beginning of the story when I started to get the runaround back and forward, until they finally denied my exemption and basically told me, you know, amongst a whole bunch of other things like you should charter a plane was one of the suggestions.
Got a spare however many thousand hanging around for that. Far out.
Well, yeah. So anyway, so yes, that's what happened, and it was unbelievably devastating to know that the government that I'm a citizen of, you know, would not make an exemption for me to see my grandfather before he died, under the guise of the protection of the people. You know, we're protecting the people from what? We're protecting the people from, you know, some diseased American/Australian expat. And it just, none of it made sense, and none of it felt like the runaround. It felt like I got passed off from person to person until they basically denied my exemption and told me if I wanted to come, that I would just still have to do the 2-week quarantine after my grandfather had finally passed away.
Which you would have missed then. I mean, firstly, even if you could have come and had to do the quarantine, you would have potentially missed seeing him anyway. You know, if you had to get stuck in quarantine and or like missed, you know, the funeral or anything anyway, because you were locked up, or you would have been if you came anyway.
Yeah, exactly. And so from the day that I applied for the exemption until the day he died, it was about, I think it was 5 days. So I had enough time because I could have got on a plane. You know, at worst, it's about a 48-hour flight to get there, having to go through Japan, because the only way to get into Australia at the moment as a citizen is you have to fly into the city that you're going into. Otherwise, you have to quarantine through multiple places. So they wouldn't allow me to go through Sydney, which most flights go through Sydney. I had to fly direct to Melbourne. And so that the only flights that were going direct to Melbourne were through Japan, which is, it ends up being a 48-hour flight altogether. And so that whole process, I still would have had enough time if they had have given me an exemption. But apparently I'm not well connected enough to be able to get an exemption. They only give exemptions to celebrities.
Well, I was going to say that, you know, how does it make you feel knowing that that's happened to you, and yet, you know, you're seeing celebrities, sports people, whoever, just getting exemptions, you know, left, right, and centre to come in?
Well, that's a part of the constant issue, and the constant, you know, frustration that I have is that when does a citizen no longer become a citizen? You know, when the government of your citizenship no longer fights for the rights of that citizen. and that's what I felt like the entire time. Where I was like, I don't feel like I have support or an advocate with the government. I feel like I'm an annoyance, and or I'm just another person that they're going to have to decline eventually, because they have their rules and their regulations, and there's no humanity anymore in this. There's no understanding. There's no process of working through that. And one of the ladies at the DHHS was very, very kind in the process, but when you're dealing with, I'm over here 15-hour difference. So I would get an email from them at 2:00 in the morning. I'd get up in the morning and I would reply to them as soon as I got it. They wouldn't get it again until later that evening, would reply to me at 2 in the morning. And so that back and forward, just delay after delay after delay.
And I kept telling them, just ticking. Like, the time's
exactly
ticking.
And that was the issue. I'm like, I need an emergency exemption to go and see my grandfather before he dies. He's the last of my grandparents. It wasn't like, oh, I've got 4 grandparents and this is one of them dying. Any death in a family is tragic, but this is the patriarch and a very, very special and important person in my life who meant an immense amount to me and was an immense support to me in my journey and my career and all the things that I've been doing in my life. He was immensely supportive. And so for me to not be able to get back, it was just unbelievably devastating to know that I could have been there, I should have been there, but the Victorian government made a decision based upon whatever rules and regulations that they have. And I remember reading an article from the Victorian Premier who was like, I don't care if you have a funeral, if you have a wedding, people are dying. And I was like, yes, people are dying. And I would like to get home to see my grandfather before he dies. But you're not going to let me because you're shutting down the state based upon numbers that are astonishingly low comparatively to, the rest of the world.
0.03%, I think, is the official number, which, and we were talking earlier about, unfortunately, people can get quite ill and pass away from things like gastro, from things like the normal flu. It's just inconsequential, these numbers that we're talking about. So
I guarantee if the Premier of Victoria had a family member in another country and somebody was going, somebody went into hospital, or there was I guarantee you that an exemption would be passed, that somebody would be able to bypass the exemption. I guarantee you, if it was an important person enough. And that's the stuff that makes my blood boil.
So there was a lot. Doesn't justify the end. It's quite disproportionate to the risk. The restrictions or what's happening to you and how that's going to affect now you and your family, disproportionate to really the risk it would have caused to, say, let someone like yourself, through to be able to see you.
Well, and that's the thing. There's a lot of, the amount of hoops I would have been prepared to jump through to go and see my grandfather before he died were astronomical. Like there was so many things I would have been prepared to do. Like I get a PCP or whatever it is, PCR test before I get on the plane. So before I get on the plane, I'm prepared to spend 4 times the amount that it would have regularly cost me to get on a plane, because it's a last minute flight to Australia. So it's anywhere in the range of like $4,000 to $5,000 US at the moment, which typically, flights to Australia would have been $1,200 to $1,500. So I'm prepared to drop that kind of cash. And I'm not a rich person. Obviously, I'm not a celebrity because I didn't get the exemption. But I'm not a rich person, but I'm willing to do that because my grandfather matters to me. So that's the first thing. Drop a ton of money on a flight. The second is get the test to prove, because you can't get on a plane without a negative test. So get the test to prove it. Thirdly, you have to wear a mask the entire time. It was a 48-hour trip that I was looking at. So, and the entire time, because I'm in an airport or on a plane, I am disallowed from removing that mask under the threat of who knows what, depending on where you are. So I'm like, I'm willing to pay this amount of money. I'm willing to get the test. I'm willing to wear a mask the entire time. And I'm willing to come to Australia. And honestly, if they had asked me when I got to Australia, take a test and quarantine until the test comes back negative, I would have been prepared to sit and wait for the 1 or 2 days, because it doesn't take any longer than that, 1 or 2 days to get a negative test and then go and see my family. But a 14-day quarantine is just nonsensical when we have technology. Literally, there's tests in the US that you can get a test within 20 to 30 minutes to determine whether or not you have COVID. And I understand some of them, could be up or down, but a PCR test, which is supposed to be the test, only takes maximum 1 to 2 days, maybe 3 days to get a test back. And I'm like, I would have jumped through all of those hoops to go and see my grandfather, but all I got was, I need a letter from this place and they need to allow you to be there. I need a letter from this place and they need to allow you to be there. I need a letter from this place. And so the DHHS is pointing to everybody else saying that they need to approve me being present without a quarantine before they'll approve it. And every single one of those places, including the funeral home, the hospital, said the same thing. They're like, we won't approve that request without the DHHS approving that request. And so I spent a week going in circles trying to get somebody to stand on behalf of what I needed, which was to see my grandfather before he passed away, and then attend the funeral with my family of the man that I loved dearly and wanted to honor and celebrate at the end of his life. But it was the same thing. So when I initially had looked at flights into Sydney, as opposed to flights into Melbourne, then it raised a whole nother thing. So Sydney won't allow you to get an exemption without Melbourne allowing you to get exemption, but Melbourne won't allow you to get an exemption without Sydney giving you an exemption. So literally they both pointed at each other.
Everyone's just doing some of these ones.
Yeah. It's like, well, if they give an exemption, we'll give an exemption. And they're like, well, I'm not going to give you an exemption unless they give you an exemption. And you're like, and so, over the matter of days, I'm dealing with my grandfather who's rapidly declining in health, my family who are trying to prepare for, this eventuality, and me desperately trying to find some way to get in the door to the nation that I have citizenship in. Like my passport literally tells me, it's like the message from the Attorney General or whoever it is on the passport that says, please don't hinder. Like I can't even remember what it is. I wish I had it with me.
I know, I could have, yeah.
Yeah, it literally says something to the effect of, the bearer of this passport, don't hinder, or, something along the effects. Anyway, somebody else.
Well, that's our basic human right to be allowed to travel freely. I mean, one of the rights that's being breached here. Our right to freedom of travel.
I would say, does a government have a right to close its border to non-citizens? Sure. It's a government's right and responsibility to protect its citizens. Like, I get that. I'm a citizen.
You're a citizen, though, so you've got a right to be protected. And as I think you were saying earlier, about if it was a war zone or whatever, the government's responsibility is to go and rescue people and help their citizens and do those things for them. And there's none of that. Absolutely none of that happening.
If you're an Australian citizen in the midst of a war zone, no matter where it is, the Department of Defense is required to do whatever it takes to protect and remove its citizens from danger. And yet the government's like, sorry, you have a slightly worse version of the flu. You can't come into your own nation any longer. And that's the part that just boggles the mind, where I'm like, and I think it ties into just people's sense of need to protect self. And I get that, there's a sense of like, well, it's working. We have some of the lowest cases in the world, blah, blah, blah. And I've heard that dialogue. I had a conversation with a friend who said that to me. It's like, well, I understand, but I don't have masks, and we're able to travel freely. And I was like, I don't necessarily agree with them, because as we just talked about, Melbourne's about to get shut down again over 4 cases. And so how many times is that going to happen before people understand like that your freedom matters? Like, I came to the US many years ago, 2003, in pursuit of dreams and freedom and all those kind of things. And one of the things that I always appreciated and loved about Australia was this sense of like wide open borders and a country that embraced immigrants, and a country that embraced this sense of national, like, we'll take on the world, and we'll be better. And it's been so surprising to me in the last couple of years to watch Australia become so isolationist. And understand, I'm like, again, if you're a non-citizen, like, I'm sorry, like, okay, they can have the right to shut their borders as non-citizens. But suddenly, when you're infringing upon the rights of a citizen to return to his own family, when there's a moment of distress or need, all of a sudden I start to question my own, like, what's the value of my citizenship? What is it worth anymore? It's not worth anything if the government that's supposed to support the rights of the citizen does the opposite and says, no, sorry, like, you don't have any rights. You can go to prison for 2 weeks if you want to come into the nation. And I say that, with care, but I don't know any other way to describe what it would have been like. Go into a hotel under guard, don't leave your room for 2 weeks. We'll bring you food to your door.
Some don't even have windows or balconies, so it is prison-like. For what?
Yeah.
An innocent, healthy person like you also, your willingness to have a PCR test, to wear a mask, you're limiting the risk to anyone else as much as absolutely possible. And yet, even despite all that, had you been allowed to come, you still would have been in that prison-like environment for no risk.
Yeah. And when I read articles about celebrities and sports guys and people that were able to, like, quarantine within a certain home, or a certain person that was able to quarantine in Byron Bay with another famous celebrity, and you're like, okay, so apparently it's one thing for the connected and one thing for the not. And that's the part that makes me furious as a Australian citizen. It was another couple of days after that, even after he had died, that they finally sent me the, like, we've denied your exemption, you can reapply.
But how did it make you feel after all running through all those hoops and all that stuff? You've missed seeing him, but obviously maybe there was some hope there that, okay, well, I may be able to still go for the funeral. And then after all that, just shut down.
Oh, it was devastating. I spent a good amount of time in tears to not be able to be a support to my family in a time of crisis like that. It's just unbelievable, and I get it. I made a decision to come to the US to pursue some career goals over here, and I don't regret that. But it's like, again, at what point in time is your citizenship no longer citizenship? When your government can literally tell you, you can't come into our nation. I'm like, are you a citizen any longer? I don't know.
Your grandfather, you were saying, was around, in between the world wars, or for some of the world wars, and he saw people during that time fight for our freedoms, and he saw, the Nazi regime getting taken down. And, could there have been a more important time for you to be able to see him with what's going on at the moment? And obviously, not being able to,
yeah. He was born in between the two world wars, so, and I mean, what an amazing life to have been born at that point in time. The things that he has seen and the things that he's done, and he's an exceptional human being that I loved very much. And I had prepared, because I knew at some point in time, he was in the late 80s. I knew at some point in time that he was going to pass, and I had put money aside. I knew this was going to take place. And so that's what made it even more distressing, was to realize that if the government says no, what am I going to do? I think about my grandfather, and I think about others that fought for the freedoms of others, especially during the world wars and other wars. And I think about my children and what kind of society they're growing up in, and what kind of world are they going to end up in if we continue to have our freedoms eroded, have our rights taken from us forcefully, without prejudice, just sorry, like you don't get a choice. You can just say no. We had a whole generation that went to war and died to fight against that kind of tyranny. And then all of a sudden we're just like, yeah, we'll just let it kind of roll over us. And it makes me concerned for Australia.
Yeah.
When I see that kind of stuff happen, where I'm like, I don't know where this leads. Do we have a say anymore? Are we sovereign citizens? Are we free people? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know either. And I've seen a lot of things written, or you hear the leaders of Australia even saying they're getting called out on their, basically completely impinging people's human rights. They're getting called up on the Nuremberg Code, like every other law that, the Biosecurity Act, you name it, everything that actually is in place at the moment. And similar to what you said before, they're just saying, so what? We don't care. We know
don't care
that, and we actually don't care. So what is going on?
Yeah. What's the cost? And I think that's, if you look back and talk to my grandfather, and he would have told you, at what cost? At what cost do we just gradually give up our freedoms, until the point that it's so eroded that we no longer recognize what true citizenship is? You have no reason to hold me if I don't have COVID, and part of this, I read an article about, the Victorian government petitioning the federal government for $200+ million to build a quarantine facility. They're not going to let this go. The quarantine is here to stay as long as you allow the government to just kind of get a free pass. What I'm going after is the infringement upon the freedom of a citizen. My rights as a citizen were taken away because I was refused access to my nation without a 2-week quarantine that was needless.
Yeah. Needless.
There were other ways around this, and my grandfather passed away, and I will not see him again. He's gone. That's it. And I loved him dearly. He was a hero in my life, and I was not able to be there at his last moments because the DHHS, with, I think at the time, 0 COVID cases in Victoria, refused to allow me an exemption to go and see my grandfather until my grandfather died, and then they denied my exemption.
I get teary because it's just, I can't actually even believe that this sort of stuff is going on. I mean, well, I do believe it. I'm seeing it, and you're the evidence that these things are really going on. And so, how much is it going to take till something changes? And to your point, like, unless an organization, another political party, the people actually stop sitting on their hands and actually get up and make a real stand, are these things ever going to change? Are they going to get worse if people don't actually stand up? And massive appreciation to you for standing up and sharing your story and letting people see your story, because I think I'd like to hope through more evidence of this and through more people sharing their stories and standing up and getting these messages out there that maybe we can make a difference and make a change and permeate out to more people so that they can also then feel the confidence to make a stand. And maybe through that we can make a real difference and change what's happening, not just here but maybe around the world.
The last thing I would say is fight for the right to be a free citizen. I mean, we had, I think often about, I have a medallion, a coin that my father sent me from Gallipoli. And I often think about the people that fought for the freedom of Australia, fought against oppression. And that's the most dangerous form of oppression, is the oppression that comes from within.